Hello, Shakil here. Welcome back. So, several times we use API and sometimes we use server actions. So, we are very much acquainted with the API because from long time we are using those who are the Node.js developer or Python developer. Those who are working with the backend, so we are very much familiar with the or acquainted with the API. You see, and sometimes we use server action. This is called server action. Okay, you see, almost like PHP, we use server action. So we use both, but we need to figure out which one is better for us and which use case is aligned with which one. Okay, and when should we use server action, when should we use API. Okay, so let's discuss this and let's dive into the deep. Okay, so Next.js API routes. First of all, let me understand what it is and though we are very much acquainted, again, even though I am discussing a little bit, API routes in Next.js allow you to create API endpoints directly with your application. This feature is particularly useful for handling backend logics such as data fetching, from submission, and more without setting up a separate server. Okay, so what we are doing over here, you see in the API, we are adding data, we are posting, we can write several logics of HTTP request, post, get, put, pass, like that. Okay. Without setting up a separate server. So it has some pros. Easy to set up, quickly create API endpoints within the page API directory, serverless functions. Each API route is deployed as a serverless function which can scale automatically. So these things are serverless. They are as runtime. They are using as runtime. It's serverless. Okay. And integrate with Next.js routing, seamless integration with the Next.js routing system. It has some cons. Cold start latency. Serverless functions might have cold start latency, especially noticeable on the first request after a period of inactivity. So if it is inactive for some time, it has some latency. Limited execution time. Functions have maximum execution time, which can limiting the long running process. Okay, so it has some cons. So when to use API routes, okay, API routes are ideal when you need to create RESTful endpoints for your application, handling complex server-side logic that is independent for your React components. So if your logic is complex, okay, so you should use it API routes, okay, requiring structure separation between front-end and back-end logics. And if you want to separate this logic, you should use API, because you see we are creating separate API endpoints, and that logic is totally separate from our front end. Okay, example use case: user authentication endpoint, say login, sign up, CRUD operation for resources, product articles, webhooks, and third-party integration. So it has another examples. API routes. API routes are traditional method. You see, it's a traditional method and old on, because those who are backend developer, we are very much familiar or acquainted with it. So it's a traditional method in Next.js for defining backend logics. They expose HTTP endpoints at the client can interact with the fetch or access request, allowing you to handle request and response for dynamic interactions. When to use API routes. Reusable endpoints. If your logics are implemented needed to be reused by multiple clients, even by external service like mobile apps or third-party integration, as API route, it is the best option. API routes can be handled HTTP requests like get, post, put. So this is very much important point. So whenever you use server actions, this is not separate. Okay, it is aligned with or fixed with the from data. Okay, so if anyone tries to use it by separate client, so it is not possible. So this is very important. So it is not reusable. Okay, so if the logic you are implementing needs to reused, so server action is not reusable, but API routes are reusable. So even by external services like mobile apps, so you can use it mobile apps, but you cannot use server action with the third-party integration or mobile apps or any other else. Asynchronous client-server communication. When you need to perform operation that involves the client making asynchronous request to the server, dynamic submitting prompts, or integrating with external APIs, API routes are essential. So if you need asynchronous behaviors, so API call is, you need API calls, real-time data or third-party interactions. For complex operation like real-time updates in a chat app or real-time data feed or interacting with the third-party services like payment gateway, API routes give you more flexibility in handling such requests. So if you use server action over here, you will lagging behind from some features. Okay. And external accessibility, API routes are accessible from anywhere, but server actions are not accessible from anywhere, including external clients like mobile app or third-party services. So if you need to logic to be accessible outside of your Next.js app, API routes are the right choice. Okay, so I think this is the very vital point to distinguish these two. When not to use API routes, when action logic is tied with the single component. So action, if it is tied, you see, it is tied with the single logic. When action logic is tied to a single component, if the logic is tightly coupled with a specific component's rendering to local UI state from submission in a single component, server action may be a simpler and cleaner solution. So if you need cleaner and simpler solution, then API server actions maybe come handy. Okay. Avoiding overheads. API routes require defining a separate HTTP endpoint and are slightly more complex to use when server actions for smaller component-specific tasks. If you don't need this flexibility, server actions might be more effective. So it has some overhead, it has some costing. Okay, API routes require defining a separate. It needs to define separately. You see, different API. Okay. And if it is Node.js, you have to create backend folders. So it needs separation. So it has some overheads. Okay, API routes require defining a separate HTTP endpoints and are slightly more complex to use when server actions for a small component-specific tasks. If you don't need this flexibility, server actions might be more efficient. So now talk about the server actions. Okay, so till now we have talked about API routes, now server actions. So server actions are new experimental features in Next.js that allow you to define server-side logic directly with your React component. This approach can simplify your code by keeping server-side logic close to the component that needs it. So logics are very close, not separate, as I have shown you. If you use Node.js, you have to it needs to come from separate folder or structure, and if you use Next.js, it's also coming from separate folder. It has a separation in between front end and back end. Okay, and here it is using serverless, but it has a separation. So this approach can simplify your code by keeping server-side close to the component. Okay, so it has some pros. Co-location of logic. Server-side logic is defined within the component, making the code more cohesive and easier to manage. Simplified data fetching. Directly fetching and manipulate data within the component without needing to set up a separate API route. Okay, it's simplified data fetching because you don't need set up a separate API route. So it's built in, or it's remain close to the, you see, it's close to the component. No separation, no face or XCS API call. Okay, better performance, eliminating the need for extra HTTP request, potentially reducing latency. As it is close and no HTTP request, so it definitely it will reduce some latency. Cons, experimental. As it is experimental, it might be stable and could change future release. Limited use case, not suitable for all types of server-side logics, especially complex. So if the logic is complex or long-running process, it is not suitable. When to use server actions. Server actions are ideal. You want to keep server-side logic close to the component that uses it. Handling simple data fetching or server-side logic that directly impact the component, optimize performance, by reducing the need for separate API request. Example use case: fetching initial data for a page, simple server-side computation or data transformation action tightly coupled with the component state and lifecycle. So it is tightly coupled, not loosely coupled. So server actions, I think you got my point and you got the logics what they are saying. Server actions are a relatively new feature in Nextjs that allow you to handle server-side logic directly within your component without needing to define separate API routes. They can be used for actions like submission, database interactions, and other server-side logic. When to use server actions? From submission in React component. If you want to handle a from submission directly within a React component without needing an API route, server actions are perfect. They allow you to define the logic for action, saving data to the database within the same file as the component. So it is in the same file. No separation, API call, no access, no face. Collocated logic. Server actions allow you to collocate the action logic within the component that triggers it. You can reduce complexity as you don't need to define separate API routes for each action. A small backend operation. Use server action for a small backend operation. So if logic is small and not complex, like submitting forms, toggling a setting, or updating the record in the database, especially when the logic is simple and not used elsewhere. Direct state mutation. If the result of the action will be directly muted, the state of your component or page, server actions can be this interaction smoother and more tightly integrated with your component rendering logic. No client-side JavaScript requirement. Server actions are executed entirely on the server and do not require client-side JavaScript, making them ideal when you want to avoid sending extra JavaScript to the client. Okay, so as it is happening inside the form, so no separation, not to send anything, no API call. Okay, when not to use server actions, complex or reusable logic. If your server logic is complex or you need to reuse it in multiple places across different components, apps, or third-party services, server actions might not be ideal. API routes would be better suited. Interacting with the external clients. Server actions are meant for internal server logic tied to a component. If you need to endpoint that external service can call third-party integration, an API route is the better choice. Real-time or dynamic operations. Server actions are typically used for on-off operations like from submission, not for ongoing real-time updates or long-running tasks. Use API for more dynamic long-running process. So this is all about server action and API calls. So I have discussed thoroughly in between API call and server action. So you got the point when you go for API call, third-party API call, separate API call, and when you need to go for server actions. So based on the discussion, you will be able to decide by yourself what should you use. Okay. Thank you very much. If you like the video, please like, share, and subscribe. Stay tuned to stay connected. See you soon. A little bit announcement. You can get a tremendous and superb course. This is my course. MERN stack, Typescript, Ecommerce, Docker, RTKquery, and along with deploy. It's a nice and huge course. So its price is $44, but I can give you for my students, I can give it only $9. Okay, so it will last for 5 days, but you will get $9. If the course is needed, you can contact with me, just $9.99. Okay, so it's a super course, tremendous course. So you will able to learn a lot of things. You will get TypeScript, e-commerce, Docker, RTK query, and deployment. So it is built on React 9.18, Node.js 20, and role-based automatic redirect. So I will give the discount link and coupon code and course link in the description box. You can come and check, and don't hesitate to grab the course. Thank you very much.